Welcome back. Thanks for staying tuned to CNN News 18. And yes, we're counting down to that all-important bilateral that's set to take place between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit. We've already heard from the Prime Minister talk about the vision India has as far as this grouping is concerned. But I want to quickly go across to Zaka Jacob, who joins me in the studio. As you know, we're really talking, Zaka, about what we can expect from this bilateral that is taking place after 5 long years. We've seen casual pull-asides between the two leaders, but the manner in which MEA has made some very important points, the big breakthrough that's been seen between the two nations at the LAC, is in fact indicative of the manner in which the two nations have decided to take this equation forward in a positive manner now.
Well, look, I think Jaishankar had said this some months ago that until the situation of the border was resolved, until the situation of the border went back to what it was pre-2020, then the relationship itself will not be normal. He had in fact called it an out-of-normal relationship or an abnormal relationship. And the reason for that was because of the changed situation of the border. So the first step towards restoring some degree of normalcy, some degree of pre-2020 status quo has been announced. A couple of days ago, you heard the Foreign Secretary saying that the last two holdout points, disengagement has been achieved and a patrolling arrangement or a patrolling agreement has been arrived at between India and China. Now, the question is, what are the contours of that patrolling arrangement? We don't know, the bare bones details of it. For example, before 2020, in a place like Dapsang, Indian troops could go all the way up to a point called patrolling point 12. And the Chinese troops would come all the way up to a patrolling point 4. Are we going back to that position? Is there now a new modus vivendi that will be operational in Dapsang? What about these buffer zones, the 5 other areas where there were these friction points, whether it was Galwan, Gogra, Hot Springs, etc.? Those places, they had created buffer zones, but in Dapsang and Demchok, which were the last two holdouts, which predate 2020. Clashes in Dapsang, for example, happened first in 2013. Clashes in Demchok happened first in 2014. So what is the new modus vivendi that has been arrived at? We don't know the details of it, but the very fact that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping will be meeting for the first standalone bilateral in 5 years. The last time they met was in 2019 in Mahabalipuram, and you had that photo op. They were at the rock caves and by the seashore and so on. There was a lot of optics around it. And within 6 months of that meeting in October 2019, you had the Chinese trying to unilaterally change the status quo. It started in April of 2020 at the height of COVID, and then in May there was a big clash, and the biggest one, of course, happened in Galwan in June 2020, in which 20 Indian soldiers died and an unspecified number of Chinese soldiers died. That was very clear that the modus vivendi and the agreements between India and China, some of which had lasted 20, 30, 40 years, were all completely broken. China had decided to unilaterally change the status quo. And, the funny part is we don't even know 4 years down the line, 4.5 years down the line, why China did so. What we do know is after 4 years of hard bargaining, and let's give credit where it's due, multiple rounds of talks between the foreign ministers, the WMCC, which is the working mechanism, met 31 times between Beijing and New Delhi. The corps commanders, the 14 Corps commander who was leading from the Indian side, they met 21 times. So 52 rounds of negotiations have happened just at those two levels, the WMCC and the Corps commanders. And then, of course, like I said, number of occasions where the foreign minister has met his counterpart, the NSA has met his counterpart, all of which led to the breakthrough that happened earlier this week. And that has now paved the way for the meeting between the principals, the first meeting between the principals in 5 years. Now, whether Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping will, discuss the nitty-gritties of what is the new modus operandi in Dapsang and Demchok, I don't think so. I don't think the principals get down into that kind of, nitty-gritties or the details. That's left to the respective delegations to work out. What I do expect them to announce, and we will get to know once the Foreign Secretary has a briefing later on before the delegation leaves back for New Delhi, is what is the directional thrust or push that is being given by both leaders. Are both leaders signaling to their respective teams and in fact to their respective countries that we're willing to put this pretty nasty episode of the last 4 years, 4.5 years behind us, and we want to sort of move forward with a new template, with a new modus vivendi, and we want to look at the big picture. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see directionally what is the vision for both Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping as far as the India-China bilateral is concerned. You would, and I would expect to see some kind of announcements on the trade, economic, investment side. Again, in broad details, I don't think either of the principals will get into the details, but in broad terms, you can expect them to say something about investment, about trade, about greater engagement between two neighbors and so on. But I think there is a greater sort of question or a greater cloud that sort of hangs over the bilateral. That is, on the one side, India has to find a way to live with China without having 50,000 troops on either side of the line of actual control. That is a necessity of the relationship, because as Pranab Mukherjee said, the late Pranab Mukherjee said, you can only get to choose your friends, you can't get to choose your neighbors. Fact is, China and India are neighbors. You have to find an operating mechanism where you don't have to have 50,000 troops, standing in an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation on either side of the line of actual control, and find a working mechanism which can stand the test of time. We had the 1993 agreement, we had the 1996 agreement, which have stood the test of time for 30, 40 years, until 2020 happened, until China unilaterally changed that status quo. So you can disengage. I think that process is now complete. The next step is going to be de-escalation, and then finally you have the de-induction or the demilitarization. Can both sides get to the point where they can see, okay, we've now found a new working mechanism, this is our new working mechanism, therefore we do not have to have 50,000 troops on those icy heights, we can call the troops back to the barracks. Can they move in that direction? If signally, if at least in directional terms, if we get a signal or two from both Prime Minister Modi and from President Xi Jinping, I think that will give you an idea of what is going to be the future trajectory of this relationship, at least for the foreseeable future.
You're absolutely right in pointing out, Zaka, that this hasn't happened overnight. In fact, the military and diplomatic negotiators have to be given all the credit. But let's talk about Russia here and the possible role Russia may have played in ensuring that this bilateral today becomes a reality. What is in it for Russia to ensure that this summit is a successful one? Where do you think Russia is coming from essentially here? Because, here's the thing. Russia, Iran, China, all part of BRICS alongside India, they will want to send out a message to the Western nations, especially the United States of America.
Oh, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think the fact that the Prime Minister separately, aside of BRICS, met with the Russian president, the Iranian president, both of them yesterday, and today will be meeting the Chinese president, will be watched very closely in Washington. It'll be watched very, very closely in Ottawa, in London, in Canberra, because I think India is also trying to send out a signal that, look, we have friends in the West and we value those strategic partnerships. Certainly, we value the strategic partnership with the United States, but it's not like we're putting all our eggs in that one basket. We have friends in other parts of the world as well. And I think, at one level, there is an inherent contradiction. How can India, for example, be part of the Quad, which, even if they don't say it explicitly, let's face it, the singular purpose of the Quad is to try and ensure free and fair and open Indo-Pacific. And the only country that is an impediment to that is China. So the Quad, the very reason for the Quad coming into existence was to try and keep a check on China. So India is one of the four sort of founder members of the Quad. And also India is now a founder member of BRICS. I mean, the very idea of BRICS was an economic arrangement, it was a term that was coined by a famous Goldman Sachs economist 20 years ago to describe back then what were the four fastest growing economies in the world. Today, these are not the 4 or 5 fastest growing economies. India is, but China is not. China has slowed down quite substantially. Even in South Africa, in Russia because of the war, growth has substantially spilled, but it's not fallen off a cliff, which is what the United States and its Western partners, NATO allies, were hoping that once the war began, and because it had become almost like an existential sort of question for Ukraine and for the very idea of NATO, for the very idea of European integration, they thought that, Russia would collapse, that Russia will not be able to keep up either the war machine or, more importantly, would not be able to keep up its economy going. But fact is, we're 2.5 years, we're going to fast approach the 3rd year of this war, and Russia is very much there. So I think for the Russians, it is to signal to the West that, look, we are very much around, we are an important pole in the evolving sort of tide of geopolitics. Russia and China have become increasingly close in the last 3 years since this war in Ukraine began. You are seeing and I hate to use the word camps or, back what we saw in the Cold War, but we're essentially moving to a two-bloc world. You'll have a US-led Western order, and you will have a bloc of Russia and China who do not want that Western-led order, do not want that US-led order. They want to change that global order. The question is, for countries like India, who have interests in both of these camps, we can't afford to choose one over the other. The question is of a balancing act. How far can you have, one foot in each boat, as it were, or how far can you go along to be part of every conversation, or at least have your representative in every room where conversations are happening? Now, to the people who say, look, BRICS inherently is a contradiction because you have countries like Russia and China, which are non-democratic. You have countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, which are democracies. And now you have a whole bunch of new members, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran. I mean, I can't think of another multilateral arrangement where Iran and Saudi Arabia are sitting across the table. But BRICS, in that room in Kazan, you saw the leader of the UAE, you saw the leader of Saudi Arabia, and you saw the president of Iran sitting across the dialogue table. So I think as far as India's strategic autonomy, and this is a much used and perhaps even abused phrase, as far as India's strategic autonomy is concerned, India would want to be part of every room where there is a conversation. India would not want to be isolated and said, okay, we will only be in those rooms where the United States is there, or its NATO partners are there, or where Asian countries like Japan or South Korea are there. India wants to be in every room where conversations are happening. With China, despite all the troubles that we're seeing on the border, trade is still huge with China. We traded end of 2023 $130 billion with China. China still, at least as far as goods merchandise is concerned, continues to be India's largest trading partner. So you can't just wish that away overnight. What I do think we will see at the end of that meeting between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi is, are you going to see an easing up on the trade relationship, on the investment relationship? For example, Chinese companies, for them to invest in India after 2020 and after Galwan, the news was really tightened. Do you see a little bit of opening up of that? Because there has been pressure from industry as well. If you go back and look at the Chief Economic Advisor's report, which came out before the budget earlier this year, he was very clear that he does foresee Chinese investment as a way to try and normalize the relationship. Of course, there was a lot of blowback to that report as well. But I think directionally, at least on the trade and economy front, you're moving towards that direction. You may not see an opening of the purse strings right away, but at least you'll get a directional signal from both the principals that they want to move in the direction of greater Chinese investment, of course, with all the caveats of national security and scrutiny and all of that added. But I think you will see a little bit more of the easing of Chinese investment into India.
India, in fact, is pretty much attempting to strike that balancing act, Zaka, because on one hand, India continues to maintain that this is not an anti-West grouping, that this summit needs not be looked at, with that intent. On the other hand, you have the Prime Minister just a short while ago say that we believe in multipolarity. So that's where you're perhaps coming from. But I also want to understand from you whether you think when the Prime Minister says that there can't be any double standards for terror funding, that's a veiled attack at China, you think? And what kind of an impression does that send out to China just ahead of the bilateral that's to take place?
Well, India has had concerns about China, particularly its meddling in Pakistan, its sort of funding, if you will, or its support tacitly or otherwise to Pakistan-based terror groups that are inimical to India. But I think that is just one part of the relationship. I think Prime Minister, ever since he came to office in 2014, has been talking about this, the adoption of the comprehensive instrument on terrorism. This is something that the United Nations Security Council has to do. I don't see the political will across nations to try and implement that, the comprehensive agreement on terrorism, to have a common definition for what constitutes terror. But I think that's just one small part of the relationship. Remember, even the Chinese have had their fair share of troubles with Pakistan-based terror groups. Just recently, we had the attack outside the Karachi airport, which was specifically targeted at Chinese companies, at Chinese employees. A few of them died as well. You have had cases in Balochistan, projects that China was undertaking in Balochistan, which was targeted again by Baloch groups. So I think, the Chinese also understand that terrorism is something that needs to be dealt with. They do that in Xinjiang, in the Uyghur-dominated areas. There have been for example, the East Turkestan groups that are supported and emanate from Pakistan, which have been a bit of a pain, a bit of a problem for China. They've dealt with that in Xinjiang as well as in some parts of Tibet, etc. So that's just one part of the relationship. I think really when Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping sit down today in that room in Kazan for the bilateral, I think a couple of factors need to be kept in mind. Number one, the very fact that this is the first time in 5 years that they're meeting. And the reason why they didn't meet was because, as External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar keeps saying, this is not a normal relationship. This has become an abnormal relationship. And until you resolve the situation at the border, you cannot expect other parts of the relationship to acquire a semblance of normalcy. And I think that's what the Chinese wanted. The Chinese wanted to say, let's keep the border aside. Yes, there are inherent problems there. There are inimical problems there. Let's keep that aside. There's so much else to this relationship that we can correct and that we can, put back on the right track. But India said, no, that's not how we view it. For us, what happened in June in 2020 was a fundamental reorientation of the relationship, was a fundamental break from what was the status quo in the relationship. And until that gets fixed, India's position was very clear. We cannot have or focus on the other parts of the relationship.
Right.
So I think that has sort of seeped through to the Chinese, at least the first step of it, which is this engagement. Like I said, this is still very much unfinished business. You still have a long ways to go when it comes to de-escalation, de-induction, demilitarization, and we'll see. I mean, the devil really lies in the detail.